So today's session is focused on how to attract and build trust with Indigenous leaders, of course featuring my good friend Carol Crowe, and we're gonna get into some introductions now. So first, myself, if you haven't met me before, Anin. My name is Mallory Nenoshkashins Indigenous Ashkikamong Dunjiva Nagiga Madavin Dodem. So my English given name is Mallory Rose, and I'm an Anishinabekwa from Curve Lake First Nation. I am of the Otter and Wild Corn clans on both sides, or on each side of my family. My background is in marketing and communications, specifically for Indigenous people, Indigenous audiences, whether that's individuals or communities and allies as well. And I love to focus on live workshop production and Indigenous cultural education and lots of things kind of in the realm of those two spheres. So what we're going to be covering today, I'll just kind of touch on this really quick. So what we're going to be covering is first why Indigenous relationships and relationship building is different, what the 4 skills are that you can hone in on and practice in order to build trust with Indigenous leaders, what the 3 risks are, or what 3 big risks are that we are going to cover today for overlooking some of the differences with relationship building with Indigenous communities. The 4th section we're going to talk about is how to transform Indigenous engagement, and this is where Carol's going to come in key and share some of her experiences on cross-cultural awareness and competency training. And then we're going to end with a Q&A. So that's what we're going to be covering. That's what we have in store this afternoon, and we have about an hour and a half to get through all this material, so hopefully there'll be time for a Q&A, but we've got lots of good examples and content for you, so I hope that you are as excited as we are. So if you're new here and this is your first time at a webinar with me, just a quick introduction. So like I said, I'm an Ojibwe woman from the Anishinabek Nation of Curve Lake, and I'm also founder of Tribal Trade Co. So at Tribal Trade specifically, we've helped tens of thousands, close to 100,000 of people to learn and celebrate and connect with traditional Indigenous cultural teachings, specifically using online learning. Over the course of the past 10 years, I've developed a Indigenous wellness course, personal wellness and personal development. That course is called Smudge Circle, and there's been close to 1,000 students through that program. I've also worked on delivering online workshops and engagement sessions to over 30,000 participants relating to Indigenous culture, corporate reconciliation, and of course, coming full circle into this one, building trust with Indigenous people and leaders. So I've worked with and collaborated with a lot of clients, major corporate brands, and small Indigenous nations. You know, it's really been a diverse mix of groups that I've supported, and a lot of my experience has been in working directly with organizations, directly with communities with my work. And I've also kind of dabbled in working with consultants and even been in a consulting role with some actual consulting agencies, and that's actually how I met Carol. So I didn't stay there forever, I'm not there anymore, but Carol and I actually met working at a consulting agency as Indigenous consultants, and it was amazing. We got to work with a lot of clients and we got to interact with each other, and I think that was the absolute best thing in the world, that we were able to cross paths in that opportunity. So Carol, I'll pass it off to you to introduce yourself real quick, and then we'll get into some of the content here. So thank you for that introduction, and now what I want to do is kind of highlight some of the reasons why each of you might be on the call today, and make sure that you feel seen and that you feel heard, and kind of represent a bit of the breadth that we have on the call. So the first reason that you might be joining us today is because you're in search of Indigenous employees or partners, relationships, communities, friends. You're wanting to build relationships with Indigenous leaders, and that term, that definition of what leaders means is really broad, and it's different, and it could mean a multitude of things, and we'll get into what exactly we're talking about there shortly. But what this could look like is, you know, maybe you're new to relationship building. You're not sure how to navigate this. Maybe you're feeling a bit disconnected from what exactly you're looking for, and maybe you're lacking a bit of confidence in that outreach and how to go build those initial interactions. Maybe you're continually asking yourself if you're offending someone. I know even to this day, even though I'm doing doing this workshop, I still to this day sometimes wonder if I'm offending someone. I think that just comes with human nature and being compassionate. But also you might be asking yourself, what is the right way to go about things? Because there's a lot of different opinions and content and guidance offered from elders and leaders and knowledge holders out there. And you just want some clarity to help you. Even if you're not new in this journey, just always continually learning and striving for self-improvement on your journey. Okay, so that could be the first reason why you're here. The second reason is maybe you're not new to relationship building, but you're having high turnover. So this could be in terms of employees or partnerships, contractors, or communities that you're working with aren't being sustained. So maybe if relationships aren't continuing at the pace that you want, or they're short-lived and you're seeking more long-term relationships, that could be a reason why you're here as well. Maybe you've heard a lot of different perspectives on retention and retainment of those key relationships that you're wanting, and you're not sure which to follow, and you're looking for more ideas and more inspiration. And maybe you're just not sure why people are leaving the different relationships that you're having or why they're not working out. Okay, so that could be the second reason. The third reason you might be here is if you're feeling like there's a lack of engagement in your environment from an Indigenous kind of emphasis there. So if you're working really hard on hosting reconciliation initiatives or anything that has to do with Indigenous people, Indigenous groups, and you're finding that there's not a ton of uptake on that or engagement, maybe you're not sure why people aren't engaged enough. You think there just should be more, and your gut or the numbers are not meeting what your targets are. Or if you have fulfillment among your Indigenous employees or peers, and that fulfillment is dipping, and you could possibly be feeling frustrated with the amount of effort that you don't feel is amounting to the amount of excitement that you would expect or that you'd otherwise hope. So I'd love to know which of these reasons resonate with you. So what I'm going to do is launch a quick poll with each of you. This is a fun feature in Zoom webinars where you can answer a poll question. So which one resonates with you the most? If none of them resonate with you, then you can maybe you could share why you're here in the chat, but I'd love to see, and if all three of them do, that's great. But if you had to pick one, which of the three kind of stands out to you most as to why you felt motivated to join us today? That's really helpful for us to learn and see what some of those responses are like. And I'm not sure if each of you can see the responses, if the voting is kind of shared publicly on the screen there. I hope it is, but I can't see it. But it looks like there's a lot in that first category of in search of Indigenous relationships. Kind of in second place following that is lacking engagement in reconciliation. So that's really great to see. So thank you so much for participation in that poll. That's awesome. So going back to our agenda here, just kind of reminding you of the content that we have ahead and where we're going to be starting, which is why Indigenous relationships are different. So I'm going to end that poll. I think we've got close to 100% participation. So thank you all so much for voting on that poll. That's greatly appreciated. And I can actually share the results there too if you're interested in seeing what the breakdown is across the group. So now I'm going to move on to this first section here of why building trust is different. Okay, so why are things different when it comes to those initial interactions and building that trust with Indigenous audiences, with Indigenous leaders specifically? It might seem obvious, it might not seem obvious, but the real quick answer here is in the trust deficit. What is a trust deficit? So the trust deficit is, specifically in an Indigenous context, is the lack of confidence or trust between Indigenous people and either colonial structures. So that might be the government, it might be corporate entities, it might be anything that represents that trust kind of breach. So it could be just corporate structures or large organizations or any branded piece of entity that represents authority. So recognizing that this trust deficit exists is so important, because if you're thinking of any like personal breaches of trust that you've experienced, you know that there's no way of moving forward with healing that trust if there's no recognition of that breach of trust, right? So the process, of course, of overcoming and healing from this trust deficit and repairing that is a long journey, but I think that just having a really solid focus on making acknowledgement and awareness and respect and recognition towards that trust deficit at the start. And we'll kind of talk about this more in different examples and how it applies to the different skills of relationship building and the skills of getting that engagement built up and how that can be more applicable. But I think just for sake of time, I'm going to move on to other areas. But if you have specific questions on that, obviously National Day for Truth and Reconciliation is coming up, and I've think everyone in the room here is familiar with that, but having clear acknowledgement of that trust deficit so that people can feel like that's acknowledged and recognized is really an important starting point. And moving on to another why here. So why Indigenous leadership is different. Indigenous leadership has like two major components that make it kind of unique. And those two major components are community and culture. Okay, so how that's broken down in the key differences of community and culture is firstly, the meaning of leadership is completely different. In Indigenous worldview, when we think of leadership, it means a different thing, right? And the equivalent, even in, like, I'm not like a fluent Ojibwe speaker, but I know that there's like certain words that represent like meanings of leadership and meanings of connection and community that tell a story. And a lot of these principles and these understandings don't like translate over to English and to Western worldviews. So I think that there's an important reflection that can be made on the meaning of leadership. And I have a graphic that I'll show right after this slide that will kind of, if you're a visual learner, will hopefully resonate. The next key difference here is how leaders are identified. So how we identify leaders in our community are not at all the same as in Western contexts. So sometimes it could be an elected leader, sometimes it could be just like our elder, our granny, or even like a leader within the youth cohort of our community. So I think that understanding how leaders aren't like held above others and that kind of hierarchical structure is the key difference as well. And then the third thing I want to share about the key difference here is the inter-community recognition of leaders is sometimes overlooked. So a natural reference for Indigenous people who are connected to community will use their own understanding of leadership in their worldview. And it's also in terms of a business context, when you're thinking of business leaders, sometimes that trauma that is kind of reinforcing and inflicting triggers for us, thinking that leadership is associated with kind of colonial entities can create alienation and a negative connotation to leadership and what leadership represents. So I think understanding these things and can be really enlightening, and this on its own could be a whole topic, but I did want to touch on it really quick and also share this visual that I've used in my personal development course, Smudge Circle, which kind of helps if you're brand new to learning about Indigenous worldview and how it compares directly to Western worldviews. This visual can be helpful if you're new to it. So before I get into this too much and kind of to keep this interactive, I wanted to share another poll with the group here, which is the following question. So which aspect of Indigenous leadership do you find personally the most challenging? So I think I have this in a poll here. Yeah. So the questions here are like navigating those cultural protocols and practices. Do you find the most challenging? B, do you find balancing culture with the needs of the business or corporate needs, balancing those two priorities to be the most challenging? And ensuring effective communication and understanding between leaders, between chief and councils or other cultural leaders or elders, that communication to be most challenging? Or do you find integrating consensus and community-based approaches to decision making to be the most challenging? I'd love to know your feedback there and your thoughts. I'm going to post that poll, and whatever jumps out at you, obviously all of them are challenging, all of them are opportunities, all of them are wonderful, but if there's one that's just jumping out to you, please vote in the poll there. And if you want to elaborate or expand upon this in the chat, that's more than welcome to do as well. There's a lot of votes for that balancing culture with business needs, which isn't too surprising, balancing culture with business needs being very challenging.
So I think starting at that point is such an organic step, and you can't do it without really having that level of self-awareness about yourself. Because even when I think about jumping into, and we'll touch on that later, but just learning other cultures, that could be a corporate culture. What am I walking into? What's required? Do I have to email to talk to the president? Do I have to go through my boss? It's no different from the protocols in a community. So when you can step back and really know how you think and look at the world, then you can start to see the world you're in and the worlds that you're going to step in a lot easier.
Shimigretch, Carol, there's one thing that you spoke about there, and like being yourself and knowing yourself. I think that is such a powerful way to connect our business identities and the way that we show up in our work to our personal lives, right? I think that's something that I particularly feel really proud from an Indigenous pride, and like knowing that the overlap and interconnectivity that we kind of live with every day, there is no separation of personal and business. Like you just bring your whole self to your work and to your personal life, and you just be. And I think that makes it easier and more authentic and genuine. And with that, a perfect lead into the next skill, which is recognizing authenticity. And the first point of recognizing authenticity here is how, isn't it ironic when authenticity breeds authenticity, right? So when you show up with your colleagues and people that you're working with on projects and in new relationships and trying to build trust and attract others, when you are oozing with authenticity and you know who you are, like you said, Carol, and bringing that presence to your introductions, to those initial interactions, that's going to bring out authenticity in others. It's going to cause that mirroring effect naturally. And this is really well known in like sales and marketing and stuff to be true. But the fact that this can be done really well and authentically and beautifully in Indigenous relationship building, I think is something that anyone can practice this skill just by reflecting on who you are. If you're of settler identity and being really true to that and kind of looking into more of your cultural heritage and your indigeneity of where it is you come from and expressing that in new relationships, like that's really a good way. Like Carol will talk about this with cross-cultural training, but that's such a good way to bind and build those connections. The second point here is identifying that connection between lived experience and recognizing authenticity. So everyone obviously has their own indigeneity and their own lived experience, and having that kind of authentic and genuine understanding of what you're bringing to the table and knowing that that's valid and not trying to force anything, which is kind of the opposite of authenticity, right? And then verifying indigeneity, I feel like is becoming more and more of a not so positive, not so comfortable topic, but a necessary one. Did you want to add anything to that last point there, Carol?
Well, I just think too, it really centers around Indigenous voices, because if we're going to really have that authentic perspective, it doesn't matter where I am at. If whatever work I'm doing, I'm always going to want that authentic Indigenous voice locally. I may be the key speaker, I may be leading it, but I still want that voice of that Indigenous person from that area, or to make sure that I'm doing it in an authentic way that's respecting, the land that I'm in. So for me, that's key. And I think there's many parts to being authentic, from education to doing call of action. People, as we're going to talk about, what are you going to do for call to action?
Right. Thank you, Carol. All right. Awesome. So yeah, we could talk about authenticity forever, but I think going on to our next skill here for building relationships with Indigenous audiences and attracting those genuine ones is active and open listening. This is the one skill and the one point that I've been asked about the most from like the larger, bigger corporations that I've had the privilege and the honor of working with. I find that the importance of listening and kind of the two sides of why it's so important is really interesting. And the more that you kind of understand what we're going to share right now, the better off that you'll be, and kind of finding that motivation, that intrinsic motivation to enhance your listening skills and your active listening skills. And that first kind of component here is representing Indigenous traditional cultures and kind of the effects that, or the role that exemplifying those traditions has in kind of looking back on the values and the worldviews that we have. So the values and the beliefs and the traditional worldviews have significant meaning and like significant importance, representation on our traditional teachings, seven grandfather teachings, but particularly in humility and in learning and in oral storytelling. So the way that traditionally our education system is kind of founded upon is in oral storytelling. So the approach of our elders passing on knowledge is not in a directive, like you need to learn this approach at all. Like that's not the culture. That's not like the way of being and the way of knowing and learning in our communities. I know there's like, we'll talk about the diversity in a sec, but that is a consistent pattern that I have recognized, is that there's wisdom-based teaching systems that exist and experience-based teaching systems. And what that actually looks like, sometimes people have a hard time like putting themselves in it. Like, what does storytelling even look like in a real sense? Like, is it sitting around the fire and like you learn something? Well, yeah, it is. sides, actually. Like listening to a story like 10 times over, you will take something new every time from that story that can help you, and applying it to the day that you just had or the week that you just had, and gathering your own conclusions and your own lessons from hearing a story from your granny or your grandpa. And that is our tradition. So being able to exemplify that and being able to follow that by actively listening instead of trying to shout at others all the time is a really good practice when you're trying to build those relationships. The second side of this piece here on the importance of listening is the effects of colonization, and this is the negative side of this importance of listening. So unfortunately, the Indian Act and residential school system have conditioned First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people to have a certain level of fear and insecurity to speak up. That's just plain and simple. There's fear of speaking up and voicing ourselves and our opinions. And that's something that is passed down from generation to generation. I recall hundreds of times being told that we are shy people and we just keep your mouth shut. I can't help it because I'm a marketer and like a problem solver to ask why? Is that really driven from personality? Like, is that my destiny and I must be shy forever? Or does it come from someplace? Did it come from a trauma? Did it come from an event? And yes, it did come from an event. I refuse to believe that we all must be shy. I don't think so. I think that when we're in the presence of our cousins and our family and our safe spaces at home, we're not shy. We're crazy at our family functions with like 30 people in a house and we're all just having fun, big potluck. We're not shy. It's because we're not feeling safe. That's why we need people to listen to us actively when we're in environments that we don't feel comfortable. It's the shame by design. Shame and shyness by design, systemic, right? So that is what has caused this need for active and open listening. So wanting to build on these relationships, and this doesn't just apply to allies. This is like the First Nations woman, me wanting to connect with leaders and like do my part. I have to actively listen to them. Like there's like no one is exempt from these skills. We all must kind of learn these skills and acknowledge that there's a really good benefit to practicing them. Carol, did you want to add anything to this listening one?
Yeah, I always like to share this example. It's something I've shared probably for 30 years is, when we think about listening, we're taught in the colonial system of the institution to listen to pounce, to listen to respond. We aren't taught to actively and openly listen, which means with your mind and your heart. And that's a whole different type of listening. And, I know an educator who shared once with me this story of, just think of it as there's a young Indigenous kid in class and the teacher says, what's a farm animal? And everybody's got their hand up because they're listening, ready to respond and pounce. And they're saying a cow, a pig. And all of a sudden she wonders, well, Fred, why aren't you sharing? And Fred says, okay, well, this one time I went to my uncle's farm and when we got there, and she's like, oh my gosh, he's not answering the question, but he is answering the questions because he's listening to what you asked him. What is a farm animal? And so he's going to give his experience and his story. And that was one of the struggles early on in the school system, is that Indigenous kids were taught differently. They were taught to give the full context, the whole story. Don't leave something out, just don't give that piece of it. And so when we look at those systems, we were taught, so that's where we all have to challenge ourselves when we're listening. Are we listening to respond and pounce like we feel like we have to? We have to catch ourselves, take a deep breath, and know, especially when you're listening to elders, those stories and learnings will come for years. I will sit back and reflect on a story an elder gave me 10 years ago and go, oh, that's the meaning of it. And that continuously happens. And so that's really important. And when you're working with leaders, the same thing's going to happen. They might have said something like very lightly that didn't resonate with you at the time, but then later you go, boy, that was brilliant. Like, why didn't I jump on that opportunity, or how did I miss that? And now I can go back and say, hey, you said something that was really interesting. They go, yeah, well, we're just waiting for someone to come forward and work with us on this, but they're not going to beg, they're not going to ask. We've got to actively listen. And I just wanted to give some kind of example that, maybe everyone could relate to a little bit on that.
I love that example. That's so sweet. And it reminds me of my son because he likes to ramble and talk. And on the topic of talking, our next skill here is communication, and not just communication for the sake of communication and for the sake of gab, but for transparently communicating with each other, and sometimes it being, just so direct to the point of overcoming that trust deficit, right? And allowing for to be conquered with sincere candor. So I think that that's the fourth kind of skill. We didn't want to leave out the importance of communicating transparently with leaders. It's often thought of as enormously refreshing to have just direct communication and openly, and whether that's done in a long thought out story or if it's done quickly, it must be transparent and it must be truthful. I think that's like the point that I really wanted to hit home here. Also, just because it's really triggering for leaders specifically to see the increasing number of false identity claims out there, or kind of not just false identity claims, but for allowing, like, you also see where there's like people are allowing like people to assume that you're Indigenous and not like kind of denying that they are, right? You're not denying that you're Indigenous and just allowing that assumption to be made. And I think that again goes to being your authentic self and being true and setting people straight and having that transparency with your background and being proud in whichever background that you have. And I think the importance of reflecting on the transparency of communication and how it really transfers across many departments, environments, opportunities, any realm of having any human experience, whether someone is being transparent and honest and truthful, completely transfers from one situation to the next. So just for the sake of time, I'm going to move on to our poll here, which is right on this topic, which is asking each of you to rank which of the skills that we just covered, those 4 skills that you find is either the most easy or difficult to either practice yourself, to show up and practice those skills yourself, or to enforce them if you have a team or other people that you are working with. Which do you feel is the most easy and the most difficult? So I'm going to post that or launch that poll. So what this one is a different type of poll. It's a ranking poll. So what you do is you put which one that you feel is the easiest, right? And these are comparatives. All of them are extremely important, and maybe some of them come easy to you, maybe some of them are all very difficult to you, but just for the sake of the exercise and for comparison's sake and knowing how you kind of rank each of them, we'd love to know which you find to be kind of like on the easier end, the least difficult to the most difficult skill to either practice yourself or to enforce with others, or just what you've experienced in your work or personal life or whatever is applicable in this situation. So the way those responses are appearing on my screen right now make no sense. It's just like tons of graphs. So I'll share the results once we've got a good amount of responses in there. Okay, so I can see we've got, oh wow, almost everyone has participated in this poll already. That's incredible. All right. So the next section of our workshop today is covering risks. This right here are risks of overlooking some of these key differences. I'm just going to share the results if you're interested in seeing that. The key differences that we talked about in leadership styles and in that trust deficit, like understanding the trust deficit or acknowledging it. What are some of the risks of not kind of adhering to or acknowledging and respecting these key differences? So some of them might seem obvious, but some of them might not be. And I just wanted to cover this really quick. This isn't a long section, but just to kind of reinforce kind of how, if you're needing to kind of bring this material back to other members of your team to try to get them to prioritize like corporate reconciliation work or something, like sometimes that's the like how corporate leaders are motivated is by, oh, what's the risk of not doing this, right? So that's why I wanted to have a little bit of content on the risks side of things. So the first one here is risks of overlooking kind of the differences in leadership style and leadership views here. So because community-centered leadership is so important to Indigenous leaders, what's the big deal or the big whoop, the key risk for not kind of prioritizing this or overlooking it? So the risk here is that you risk being perceived as first self-serving, right? So if you're not kind of leaning into the community approach and the collaborative outlook that is so deeply embedded in Indigenous worldviews and in our community's priorities. You could be perceived as like a self-serving body. You could also be perceived as misaligned, right? That's a very professional term that could be kind of faced if you're reaching out to work with community or work with a leader. Oh, we're just misaligned. And that could be because you're overlooking those key styles. You could also be perceived as like patronizing if you're not like really embracing those key differences by like leaning into those community-centered approaches. And I wanted to share some highlights here of what this actually looks like, in the realm of like tactically, tangibly builds trust. So when you think of like people that you trust, whether it's like public figures or people of authority and people that you think, okay, I would go to them for advice and go to them for lessons, it's usually people that are like credible, right? People that you know well, and they therefore have a high level of credibility. So within Indigenous communities and our views and the way we make decisions on who we will trust and not is credibility. And credibility comes down to, or how we dissect or what is worthy of credibility is another key cultural difference. So when you're trying to build trust and credibility from like a communications, marketing, branding perspective, it means different things to different audiences, obviously, right? But with Indigenous community members and leaders, a lot of this comes from like family members, right? Our family members, our elders, our cousins, doesn't matter their like proficiency. It's totally based on like, do I know this person and are they related to me? I know that might sound crazy, but I think that can like resonate. I hope that resonates a little bit for you, Carol. But I think that like evaluating that, how we see trustworthiness and kind of the importance of relying on the opinions of elders and like chief and council, and how chief and council really embeds like the importance of elders in those decision making. I think it's to be taken seriously. And also the community driven approach to leadership, I think, is key. One of the clients that Carol and I worked with was like wanting to work with like professionals in the oral health space. And I think it was advised to kind of work with like a professional public speaker and not like someone from the community. And I remember Carol and I like really emphasizing like, no, you need someone from the community. Like the community recognizes someone from the community, and like what better way to reconcile than amplify those voices of community members that not only instills pride in like someone who is a leader within the community, but someone that you can relate to as well in their own story.
And really advocates that positive change, because that's what we're always looking in an authentic Indigenous leader, is that's what they're navigating up front for us.
To kind of go back to how we're like reflecting on credibility and leadership here, I think sometimes this can seem a little bit backwards because of the erosion of like traditional leadership roles. So if you're thinking of like, oh, how is leadership decisions made and how like our traditional like governance systems structured in Indigenous communities historically. And I think that because our leadership systems are matriarchal in nature, this right here is the first female elected chief in Canada, Elsie Knott, who's actually my great-grandmother. Elsie Knott Lane is the lane that I grew up on as a child, and reflecting on how there's like a direct kind of opposition of the colonial style of leadership and the Indigenous style of leadership. It speaks to a lot of like clashing, right? And I think that just being aware of that as a starting point as to like, why is this difficult or why does this feel unnatural? It's because the foundation for leadership and how that's structured in society is clashing. It's just naturally clashing. So, and then you see it in media as well, right? You see the leadership styles and how important representation and women as leaders are represented in media. I don't know if anyone's seen this film, The Killers of the Flower Moon, but having the importance of how, and I don't mean like the representation of the media, but representation of like the storyline and the truth of this story itself, like the plot, and how like Indigenous women and like the leaders of that tribe were kind of like taken advantage of because of like the way that the governance structure was established in that nation. I know we're getting real specific here, but before we get into the weeds too much, I'm going to move on to the next risk here, which is risks of overlooking the trust deficit. So overlooking the trust deficit really is, I think, the biggest risk of all, and it's the most obvious, but it risks displaying ignorance. And I know many people like to say like ignorance is bliss, but ignorance is not bliss, especially in Indigenous relationship building. I don't mean to chuckle, it's just, this is a serious matter. But overlooking the trust deficit is like a considerable risk for corporate leaders, and it just exacerbates the existing tensions and hinders any potential partnerships, collaborations that can be made. And I don't want to spend too much time on this because we still have more to go, but it really just reinforces historical injustices. Any like interactions that you're having and any hints of ignorance can be just extra triggering for leaders, for partners, employees, any of the sort. So by not addressing this like with a big bright yellow highlighter, like if you're unsure, can have like really bad reputational damages. It can damage like corporate reputations, like personal branding, like your professional brand. Just think it's really good, like when you're, at least when you're new, like when you're in a new interaction with an individual, making sure that they're aware of the fact that you're not ignorant, right? And that you're aware, and just to be safe, that's a big risk. So just wanted to highlight that. The big one here that I feel most positive to now transition into is the risk of diversity spectrums. And I think that whenever I talk about diversity spectrums, I feel like it's a really exciting kind of way to look at diversity. Diversity is often like defaulted to background only, and it's defaulted to like singular and compartmentalized outlook on diversity. And I'm constantly trying to encourage people to look at diversity from a different lens, which is from a lens of spectrums and an interconnected system of different scales of diversity that are not based on one thing equals this or one thing equals that and making assumptions, but things being completely independent and fluid. So the way I'll explain this is like, if you're overlooking diversity as being spectrum oriented instead of binary, this means you could be missing out on opportunities, right? If you're thinking of diversity in a small kind of afterthought approach, you're missing out on the wider benefit that could be had by looking at it using a spectrum approach. You could be missing out on opportunities that deepen your understanding of, even if we're just talking about not cross-cultural awareness, but Indigenous cultural awareness, like deep understanding of teachings and values and nuances and differences, right? They're really beautiful. And by kind of blanketing diversity into diversity is 3 groups: Indigenous, Métis, Inuit, and First Nation. Like that's so surface level that you miss so many opportunities to actually learn the good details of who we are, right? And it also misses out, you can miss out on engaging in those multicultural perspectives and kind of differences and nuances. And I mean, I could go on, but without further ado, I want to share this visual here that kind of depicts what these diversity spectrums mean. So what it means is that having diversity, not just in a background, not just in a funnel of like someone has lived experience or they don't, or someone identifies as Indigenous or First Nation or they don't, they have status or they don't, right? All these like binary outlooks on diversity and identity, that's like a directive from the government, and that's a colonial view. And that's, I'm sure it's another way, it's like could be like scientific, I don't know, like I'm not like a science background, but I think that having a spectrum approach of how these things work, and like community connection being a spectrum, there's not like yes you are, no you aren't. One of these spectrums causing the other spectrum to be at a certain point is also not a thing, right? And I think that looking at these spectrums from the lens of the environment as well. So one week I could feel really connected and I could feel deep rooted and close to my culture, and then the next week I could feel not, and that's totally okay. And you can't just like pinpoint and slap a label on someone as being one thing or another. It shifts and changes all the time, and having that approach can be really valuable. I do have a poll for this, just kind of talking about the risks. But before I move on, Carol, did you want to talk about the spectrums at all?
I always think of that example that an elder shared with me, and he said, take on a piece of paper, write community on the top and business on the bottom, and put a line between it. And that's what you're living in the colonial system. You live one way in your life and another way in another of your life. And in a community, take that away, because you have community and business. It's all interconnected, and very much it's a moving, it's not, it changes constantly. So I thought you described that really well.
Okay, so now on to our final poll of the afternoon, which is which of these these 3 risks that we just covered do you feel affects relationship building with Indigenous leaders the most? So that first one is underestimating differences in culture, overlooking that need for equity or overlooking the attention that is needed on the trust deficit, balancing the interests and needs of the individual that you're speaking with, or placing assumptions by overlooking diversity. So I'm going to share that poll. If you would be so kind to share your vote, and if you want to elaborate in the chat, that's of course welcome as well. So as we are wrapping that up, I'm just going to move on here to our last section here, Carol, which is all about that engagement. How do we get people engaged? They don't care. What do we do about people? How do we make them care, make them want to show up, and make them want to love us? No, I'm kidding. That's sorry, inappropriate joke, everyone. This next section here is all about transforming our engagement that we're having with, could be your team members, it could be individuals that you're wanting to build that relationship with, any kind of applicable group or individual, making them feel more engaged, more fulfilled, and kind of bringing the energy out of them. So I'm going to pass it off to Carol for this section. Do you want to show the 3 ways first, Carol, or just dive into the first one?
Sure. Let's see the 3 ways. And, just when I think about cross-cultural awareness, it goes both ways. That's exactly what it is, cross-cultural awareness, because we do need to learn about each other. We need to understand different worldviews because there isn't one. I know we often talk about the concept of two-eyed seeing, which is incredible, but there's so many. And so every community that you go to is going to be a little bit different. So when we spend the time, and I was just having a debrief last week with a team that I was working with, and we were talking about this subject because before I even go out to a community, I've done a lot of research. I've learned that community. I've watched YouTube videos. I've gotten to know their land base, their concerns, their struggles, to really understand anything I can before I get there, because that's just background research. That's just, knowledge that's shared online. It isn't that lived experience yet. I haven't got to the truth-telling stage because I don't know if that's all truth or if it's just information that's just been shared or who it's been shared for. I haven't had a chance to validate it. So to me, when I get to the community, that's where I'm going to really learn. That's where it counts, because if I don't build those relationships, I won't go through that truth-telling stage of really knowing, is this what happened to community? Because you can go into a community and not know of maybe them being relocated, and it was relocated for a mining activity, and maybe you didn't know about it because it was such a small mine or it wasn't in the news, and you're going to talk to them about a development, and all of a sudden you don't have that information, and you say something that might just, everything that Mallory's been sharing till now, really the risks, all of that contribute to this, because then you're at the stage where, oh my gosh, what have I done? So you really want to make sure that you're taking that cross-cultural training and awareness authentically, developing it over time and continuously. This is not like, even for me as a seasoned, engagement person for 40 years, Mallory, you've been in this a long, long time. We're constantly doing this. We're constantly wanting to know, okay, what do we need to know about the community? Is there protocols we need to know? How do we approach them? Is there a certain way we should approach them? Do we do tobacco? What's required of us? Is there anybody we missed? Is there other communities that we need to engage, even though we're told these are the only communities? So those steps will completely make a difference if you're wanting to engage with a community, if you're wanting to work or partner with a community. And the learning process has to be reciprocated. So it's really important that also you share your approach, your business. Because even with government, I see this often. If you explain to a community your process for decision making, how things work, just like you're expecting from a community. I've seen in some of the comments, things like the dollar values don't align, like the thinking. Well, actually, in some ways they do. My experience, and I can't certainly speak for others, but I know that everybody still has to live. Everybody still has to work. Everybody still needs a job. It's how it's done and the approach it's done. And so we start to build a better understanding of what our core values are. So the core value of a corporation, of course, it's profit. The core value of a community, it's going to probably be language and land. And so when we start to overlap those, we start to see where those opportunities are. And that's where we start to make connections. And that's where we start to see progress and performance. And we get to those stages where we might get the partnership we want. We might build the friendship and the long-term opportunities, the better we can come together with those, two worldviews. So I just stepped through a whole bunch of these, didn't I? So really, the cross-cultural, and why don't you jump into these ones, Mallory, a little bit here, and I'll add as we go.
Yeah, so this first one here on cross-cultural awareness and how it's really helpful and bringing in engagement. I find that whenever I've worked from the lens of like DE&I and how you can make individuals that maybe aren't self-identifying as a diverse background, how you can make them feel kind of connected to Indigenous issues or connected to reconciliation, I always encourage the use of the medicine wheel teaching to help with the like kind of connecting people to each other, right? Like we all four nations have a shared collective worth, and we have the closest proximity is there isn't one group that has a closer proximity to the creator than another. We all have a place and value on Mother Earth and a shared responsibility of taking care of her. Like having that approach and that teaching helps people care about each other, I find. So anytime that I'm finding that people are having like just a tough time like getting their heart into things, enlightening them on the medicine wheel teaching and how the teaching is so just like it speaks to the interconnectivity of all of our relations. And if you're not like, I'm sure if anyone on the call here is not familiar with it, like there's lots of materials on like Tribal Trade Co website and other sources on the YouTube channel, like and other websites too, but like learning about the interconnectedness and how it's so like natural and just makes sense and is balanced. It just makes things seem like it just makes sense. I don't know how else to put it. It's just so natural that how could you not like want to follow that approach to your life to feel good and to care about your neighbor who you share a future with and who you share your grandchildren will have, shared future with their grandchildren, right?
I was just going to add to that too, and just to add, for anybody who's not familiar with the medicine wheel, it was a ceremony, and the part that was brought out of ceremony is the part that we're experiencing now, where you'll see on many Indigenous people use foundationally. But these were actually medicine wheels on the land that helped community, leaders and knowledge holders make decisions and write down on the ground, and those rocks were aligning with stars. Like it was a very creator, spiritual centered ceremony. And now what we're seeing is we're using these methodology in our way of teachings and ways of knowing so that we can make that connection and be inclusive of the emotional, mental, physical, and spiritual well-being of ourselves. And we all know in the, working and living in the corporate entity of the colonial system, that emotion very much and spiritual was not part of that. It was, very, don't wear your heart on your sleeve, or you wear your heart on your sleeve and you shouldn't, and to be a whole. And this just really makes us whole, because I always think of this as a teaching that all of us have to do every day, is to do a check-in. Like these are quadrants that we all need to at least sweep, how am I taking care of myself? And we're never 100% balanced. This is something that is ongoing, moving. It isn't, no one's ever 100% emotional, mental, physical, spiritual well-being. We're all kind of always off trying to navigate that. And I think that's really important for us. Again, back to that, know yourself so that you can know each other, so that you can be more inclusive. And that does create that, shared value and that collective worth, because the collective mindset is so important in that thought leadership that we share in our thinking, and we collaborate as much as we can. We know that always makes a big difference. So I just wanted to add that in there.
Yeah, and I see the comment on there that like medicine wheel does not resonate with every community and every like teaching system. Like I think that that's important to know that, and thank you for your comment there. I think that having just like a good understanding of as many teachings as you can is just good learning practice. And on the topic of learning, I don't know why everything is flowing into the next here. It's not even on purpose. But the next point here for cross-cultural awareness and how it's really valuable for creating stronger engagement is really the reciprocity approach to learning methods, and having kind of like a relational, like two-way or multi-way, and not like a top-down. As long as it's not top-down, more of like a circular, equality-focused learning method here. So I think that this applies to recruiting, performance, review and development, any ongoing like problem solving that you have with your teams or negotiations with external parties, right? Like we're constantly learning about ourselves, others, like teachings and values, and just getting to know like how to do things better. And I think that having like an approach that is, again, like based on like a circle and based on a collective approach and shared values can be accepted much better. And that's just like the activity and exhibits a more like culturally appropriate approach. So Carol, I know we're getting close to time here. I want to have about like, I don't know, maybe 10 minutes for Q&A, but we've just got this one and then one more of our points here.
Yeah, I'll just add in there, and it's just being aware of yeah, exactly as you said, those differences. The Western world, very compartmentalized and separating humans from land, from wildlife, where that Indigenous worldview is very much everything we're related to. We're related to the land, the animals are our relatives, and it's all that we need to take care of within our own, selves. We have this world that we need to be aware of. And the Western context is a little bit different. It compartmentalizes it in a way that somebody else is responsible, somebody else looks after that, somebody else does that, where when we take that holistic view, we're all responsible.
Yeah, and the last kind of point that we wanted to touch on here with the importance of cross-cultural competency and cross-cultural awareness is kind of the cause and effect, and like bringing to light the importance of performance and how performance and team culture are kind of like one and the same. This image I actually grabbed off of, I don't know if you're like a Gary Vee fan at all or not, everyone, but like Gary Vee often like talks about the importance of company culture and how it stems from the top, how it stems from leadership. And I think that an important kind of reflection there is how like there's culture of a team, culture of a company, and how that kind of breeds good performance, and the connection there I think is often understated. So I know that, Carol, you have a ton of experience in like cultural safety, and I just wanted to give you some space to highlight. These are the points that I wanted to bring to light, kind of connecting the two and how important it is for high retention relationships.
Yeah, and this really goes back to what you said at the beginning, Mallory, is if you want to keep your employees, if you want to retain people, if you want to build those partnerships, these are all, the critical components, is to create that company culture that is welcoming, that does honor people in a good way, because there's interpretations that might come out of someone's difficulty or background or hardships that may be interpreted in a very stereotypical way that provides no guidance or leadership to help, maybe a new employee who's struggling with something to get through that difficulty because it's something that they're facing. I remember, and I'm going to go back to the school example, only because it allows people to relate. We got a young boy that's always showing up late, and every day he's late for school, but every day he's got his homework done, and he's so proud of that. And one day the teacher says to him, you're late every day you're late. Why are you late? And he says, I'm sorry, I get all my siblings up and I feed them all and I get them all ready for school, and then I walk to school and it takes me an hour to get here. And if the teacher didn't ask that, can you imagine that teacher might be just saying, oh, what a brat, somebody must be doing his homework for him, kind of thing, and not really looking at the individual. And I use that, because I don't want to use like a corporate context in this, because it starts in the stereotypical life of a young person. Where does that begin? And when we start welcoming people in and being open, and I'm not saying that, if somebody's late for work, that's the cause of it. I'm just giving you an example that there could be things like transportation or other issues or other obstacles that, and I'm sure many of you have heard these obstacles, but you have to be able to be willing to listen. You have to, get through that truth and that understanding. I had a sister-in-law, one more thing I was just going to add. She wanted a job so bad. She was living at Kakawishtahow. The nearest town was 2 hours away. She got a job in town at the motel. There's no buses from a reserve. There's nobody to drive her. her. And at the beginning, it took her 4 hours on her bike. Eventually, she got it down to 2 hours. Can you imagine riding your bike for a job every day for 2 hours? And she never complained. She was just a role model. See, for me, that's a role model. So when you look at it, and so often, as you've said too, Mallory, Indigenous people might be a little quieter. We got to overcome the shyness and the shame associated with the conditions that so often many of our people live in. And that if we're going to change that, if we're going to reconcile, if we're going to do some truth telling, we're going to be open to those relationships and how we build them and how, we get that good company culture going.
That is an amazing example, two examples that are really applicable to this. And I think that I love that the examples aren't specific to like a corporate environment, because I think that like the specificity that is often used is just deterring us from the opportunity of the like interconnectivity that we need to kind of breathe and live more of, like the personal life and our childhood and all of those experiences that are creating humans and creating our lived experience now. So I know this has been a lot of material, a lot of examples, and I wanted to extend a big congratulations and for making it through to the end.